Hi, and thanks for joining us for our late corn and soybean planting decisions video. I'm Jim Mintert, Director of the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, and joining me is my colleague, Dr. Michael Langemeyer, who's a professor of ag economics and also the Associate Director of the Center. We're going to discuss the options available to you with respect to late planting of corn and soybeans here, especially in the Eastern Corn Belt. And we're going to review some details and maybe draw some inferences and give you some things to think about as you make your decisions about what to do on your farm here as we continue to struggle with this delayed planting season. So let's just kind of start off with some of the details. We've had delayed corn planting throughout the Corn Belt. As of earlier this week on June 2, USDA indicated that approximately 30 million acres of intended U.S. corn acreage has not been planted yet. About 12 million of those acres are in the Eastern Corn Belt states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. There's been some planting progress made this week, but it's not clear how much as we've continued to monitor the weather patterns. There's been showers moving through the Corn Belt. Some places have been hit by showers and people have not been able to plant. In other areas, planting progress has probably been significant. So we'll find out next week exactly how much planting progress has been made. But for many of you, that's really decision time with respect to what you're going to do on your farm. And your options are take prevented planting under federal crop insurance. Number two, you can plant corn late, and we're going to talk about that in some detail. And number three, you could simply switch your acreage that was originally intended for corn and switch it to soybeans. So let's look at some of those details. Michael, let's kind of review the late planting corn insurance coverage.
You referred to it earlier in the webinar. The final planting date for corn, this is for corn, is June 5th for full insurance coverage. And this is passed, obviously. You can still plant corn, however, and insure corn from June 6th through June 25th, but coverage is reduced. It's reduced 1% per day during this 20-day period. The planting date, the final planting date for soybeans is later. Here our focus is on corn. So let's just look at an example, Jim. Let's say we planted some corn on June 10th. If we planted some corn on June 10th, this would reduce our coverage by 5%. We've got the calculation there. So rather than an 85% coverage level, you'd have an 80.75% coverage level. And we've got the math illustrated there in case you want to look at different planting dates. 95% times 85% gives us an 80.75% coverage.
All right, so let's take a look at those details, those options in some detail. The first one, go ahead and plant corn. First of all, you've got the risk of reduced yields. That's a concern, obviously. And not only average yields declining, but there's really kind of a risk in terms of an increase in variability in those yields. Your insurance coverage declines 1% per day starting June 6, as you mentioned. The second option is you could simply stop planting corn and simply switch over to planting soybeans. If you plant soybeans up through June 25th, your crop insurance coverage will simply switch over to soybeans as if they were intended for full season soybeans. If you plant soybeans on acreage originally intended for corn after June 25th, you can still insure the soybeans and receive a partial prevented corn planting payment, which would be equal to 35% of the full corn prevented planting payment, which of course is 55%. And then your third option is to simply say, all right, I'm done. We're not going to plant this, and take the full corn prevented planting payment equal to 55% of the original corn revenue guarantee. And if you do that, you avoid the corn production cost, and of course that's going to be huge in our decision-making process.
And I'd say farms, perhaps some farms, are doing all three of these. In different combinations. You have some acres that are just extremely wet. It's going to be very difficult to plant. There you're looking at the third option, but you might have other acres that was difficult to get in a timely fashion, but you can still get in, and then you're looking at option 1 and 2. You know, should I still plant corn, or should I switch over to soybeans and take account for the fact that soybean yields aren't reduced near as fast as corn yields?
And that's a great point. It's not an all or nothing decision, right? You can do it on a farm by farm basis. So keep that in mind as you move ahead here. All right, let's look at some details here. And the easiest way to do this is really just look at an example and then make some adjustments for your own individual situation. So we're going to start off with an example that's really targeted towards the high-yielding part of Indiana, high-yielding soils. We're going to assume you've got a trend-adjusted APH corn yield of 209 bushels per acre. The average of December corn futures for the month of February, which was used to establish those crop revenue guarantees, was $4 a bushel. If had revenue protection coverage of 85%, which is pretty common, especially in the northern half of Indiana. Southern Indiana, 75 and 80% is probably more common down there, but in the northern half of Indiana, 85% is pretty common. Let's walk through the computations, Michael. Revenue guarantee.
Revenue guarantee, if you take your 209 bushel times the $4 projected price times your 85%, because we're assuming 85% coverage level, that's approximately $711 per acre. To get the preventive planning payment, we take the revenue guarantee multiplied by that 55%. Now, there is some people that bought up coverage, and so some people might have 60% preventive planning on corn, but the 55% is the standard unless you bought up to get the 60%. And so using the 55%, that gives us a preventive planning payment of $391. It's pretty high, Jim. There's going to be some land maintenance cost. I mean, you're going to have to control the weeds on that preventive planted acreage or plant a cover crop or other mechanisms to control the weeds. And so we've assumed $30 here. That may be more or less, and so use your own figure for that. But we've assumed there's going to be at least some cost associated with maintaining that ground. So after you've subtracted the $30, you end up with a kind of a net revenue from preventive planning of $361. Now, what we're going to do here on the next slide or two is we're going to compare this $361 to the return above variable cost, which we call contribution margin in the Purdue crop cost budget, to growing corn or soybeans. And we'll look at this on a couple different dates. We'll look at a date similar to today's date, and then we'll look at a week from now or 8 to 9 days from now and see how that changes this comparison between corn, soybeans, and this prevent plant payment that's illustrated on this slide.
So the benchmark is to start off by estimating what your prevented planting payment would be, net of any additional cost you might have, which are fairly minimal, but not zero. I think that's key to think about. And as you pointed out, that's not a small number in many locations here in the Eastern Corn Belt.
Now, one of the questions that might come up by some people, but I think most people know this, is notice we've used the projected price of $4 here. It doesn't matter what happens to the harvest price on crop insurance. Preventive planning is calculated with the projected price, and so that's very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, a little later we're going to talk about the harvest price option, but to benefit from that, you have to plant.
You have to plant.
So let's take a look at some details. Here's our scenarios. So we're going to compare prevented planting compared to planting corn late or soybeans. So scenario one, take full prevented planting payment for corn and leave the land idle and control the weeds, as you mentioned earlier. Scenario two, we're going to assume crops are planted on June 7th. Based on some estimates both from Purdue and the University of Illinois, we're expecting that to give you about a 20% decline on average in corn yields and about a 15% decline in soybean yields. Remember that your crop insurance on June 7th for corn would decline 2% because you're roughly 2 days beyond that final planting date of June 5th. So 1% for each day gives you that 2% discount on your crop insurance coverage. You still have full crop insurance available, however, if you choose to plant soybeans on June 7th. And then your third scenario is plant crops on June 15th. We kind of picked that as kind of an arbitrary mid-month date. That would give us about a 30% decline on average with respect to corn yields and about a 20% decline in average soybean yields on that date, again based on data from both Purdue and the University of Illinois. Corn crop insurance on June 15th would decline 10% because you're even farther past that June 5th final planting date. And again, full crop insurance coverage is available for the soybeans.
Now, one of the things we want to keep in mind here is we've used 20% decline in corn and 30% decline in corn in scenario 2 and 3. Those are kind of average figures, if you will. As you get further and further into June, the variability of those corn yields is going to be greater. And so you have to realize here that we're just using averages here. If you want to look at this from a risk perspective, it gets riskier. Certainly for corn, but also for soybeans, planting these crops later in June. And so that's very important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's right. And that window starts widening the deeper you get into the month. That's key to, I think, for long-term decision making. So let's look at the scenarios. So here's our first one. Scenario one, take the prevented planting payment and have that variable cost for corn reduced to just $30 for land maintenance. Everything else is not applicable. Let's look at scenario two. If you plant on June 7, our variable cost for producing corn, about $470 per bushel, or per acre, sorry. Variable cost for producing soybeans, $262. That does include a little bump up on that soybean seeding rate, so we did capture that in there. It didn't make a huge difference in our budgets, but it did make a modest difference. As you move deeper into June, you're probably going to want to bump up your soybean seeding rate. As we mentioned before, 20% reduction in corn yield is what we're using in these budgets, a 15% reduction in soybean yields. That takes that 209 bushel corn average that we started the season with down to an expected 167 bushels per acre, and takes that soybean yield down from an expected 65 bushels per acre at the beginning of the season to an expected yield of about 55 bushels per acre. And then let's move forward and look at the June 15th option. Production costs aren't really changing, a modest bump up again on the soybean seeding rate, so that gives us a small increase in soybean cost. But yields coming down even more. As we mentioned before, corn yields down 30% from their optimum, soybean yields down 20% from their optimum, and that brings us down to 146 bushel expected average on corn compared to 209 at the beginning of the season, and 52 bushels per acre on soybeans compared to 65 at the beginning of the season. All right, so let's take a look at the budgets and see how this starts to shake out. Michael, I'll let you kind of walk through this.
Okay, let's start with scenario one, which is a preventive planting payment. The corn price is not relevant in this case because we're not going to plant corn. And so remember from our previous slide, we had an expected gross revenue of $391. We subtract the $30 for maintenance, we have $361. If we compare that to planting soybeans, here we have an $8.85 soybean futures price. We got this earlier this morning. Jim grabbed that and used that. And then Jim, you forecasted basis here for the fall. You want to talk a little bit about what you've done there?
Yeah, so what we did is we used the crop basis tool. It's available on the Center for Commercial Agriculture's website. And in the case of soybeans, we used a 2-year average, which based on the research one of our colleagues, Dr. Nathan Thompson's been doing, has been the best basis forecast for soybeans. And that's a fairly negative basis we're forecasting, but keep in mind what's been taking place in the soybean market here the last year and a half. And that's reflected in that basis forecast. That gives us an expected fall delivery cash soybean price of $822. That brings us a revenue figure of $454.
And so the expected net soybean revenue, or return over variable costs, contribution margin, is the same terminology, is $192. And so do soybeans have an advantage over corn? No. That's why it's a negative number. The preventive planting payment is considerably higher than the net return for planting soybeans in this case.
Yeah, so for clarity, what we're doing is we're comparing that expected net corn revenue number of $361 to the expected net soybean revenue number of $192. And in this case, the corn is obviously $169 higher than the expected soybean revenue. So in that scenario, if you're looking at simply taking the preventive planting payment versus planting soybeans, pretty dominant that you would choose taking the preventive planting payment. And that's what the marketplace has been talking about here in recent days. Why we're so concerned, I think, on a nationwide basis about how many acres might go into the preventive planting program. It's these kind of calculations.
And it's also leading to volatility in corn futures price. Probably an obvious point, but certainly that's contributed immensely to the volatility in corn futures price recently.
All right, let's take a look at scenario 2, which would be plant corn versus plant soybeans. I'll let you walk through that.
And so we're using a December 2019 corn futures price of $426. That's a little lower than what it was 2-3 days ago, but that's the this morning price with a basis like Jim was talking about, a basis estimate of 34 cents. This would give us a gross revenue of $656, and so obviously the gross revenue is higher if you plant a crop versus the preventive planting, but you have $470 worth of costs, and that brings the expected net corn revenue down to $186. Again, if we compare that to soybeans, there's no difference between the soybeans in scenario 1 and scenario 2 because it's still a June 7th date. So expected net soybean revenue of $192. It's really a coin toss. If you look at scenario 2, a very similar profitability. I think we were a little surprised at this. We thought that they might actually be an advantage towards corn, but I think the fact that we've taken some out of the corn futures price in recent days has made this more of a coin toss.
Yeah, it looked more attractive when these futures were up closer to $450.
And so that's important to keep in mind. I mean, we're just using a snapshot of what the futures price, are this morning. You want to think about what the futures price might be, and so use some different scenarios in there and see how that changes the calculations here.
Let's take a look at scenario 3.
So scenario 3, here we're looking at the same prices, but remember we have that rather large drop in yield. You're planting corn June 15th. That's a little late for Indiana, for most of Indiana, and so that gives us expected crop corn revenue of $574. After we subtracted the cost, we're down to $104 expected net corn revenue. Well, we haven't said it yet, Jim, but we need to. That's a return over variable cost. You would still need to cover land costs, cash rent, you still need to cover machinery ownership costs, and you still need to cover labor. And so there's a lot of costs that have to come out of that 104. So obviously from a earnings perspective, that's quite negative. And we compare that to expected net soybean revenue. If we use the same price again and use our 15% yield reduction, we get expected net soybean revenue, return over variable cost for soybeans, of $161. And so clearly, as you get past June 7th, there's an advantage towards soybeans.
Yeah, and I think we kind of knew that before we did the budgets, but it is kind of clarified. As you start moving past the 7th or 8th of June, very quickly, any advantage that corn might have had becomes eroded by that fairly dramatic drop in corn yields.
Now we're going to talk about what's missing here next, but before we do that, Jim, let's look at that scenario 3 and just make a couple comments about yields and prices. Here again, we've used average declines in corn and soybean yields, and we don't have a lot of data a lot of times for these late plantings, and so that's hard to predict what those declines are actually going to be, and so you have to keep that in mind, and also remember it's quite variable when you get that late in planting, so that's important to keep in mind. But Jim, if you would comment a little bit on the upside potential for corn and soybean futures. Does one of them have more upside potential?
Well, before we do that, let's back up just a little bit and look at some of the numbers, and then we'll talk about that. So in terms of comparisons and thinking about maybe doing some of your own computations based on the analysis we presented here, what you want to do is compare that prevented planting payment, that $361, to the expected net soybean revenue in this case. Mm-hmm. And clearly, as you look at it, not only did the prevented planting payment look better than planting late corn, better than late soybeans as well. And then as you go farther down the line, that simply becomes exacerbated. So that kind of takes us to where you were going with respect to price. With 30 million acres unplanted, Corn Belt wide, these numbers are going to change a little bit, obviously, as you move around the Corn Belt, but prevented planting looks pretty attractive. And so one of the challenges we face is how many acres are actually going to wind up enrolled in the prevented planting, and what is the impact going to have on corn prices. And the market has really struggled with that. Yes. That's why we've seen not only the increase that we've seen in recent weeks since about the middle of May, but also the volatility. And I think as you think about where we're going with respect to planted acreage, I think the report that USDA releases on the crop progress next Monday is going to be very important. People are going to look at that very closely with respect to how many acres were planted this week, how many acres remain to be planted, and then thinking about how that traces back through the World Ag Supply Demand estimates and what that does to corn supplies and reducing the carryover.
Now, one of the things that a producer could do is plug in different prices to situations similar to what we have on the screen here. And one of the if you do that, I would encourage you to use something like the iFarm price distribution tool at the University of Illinois. It'll give you a possible distribution of prices using options. And for example, I was looking at that yesterday. There's not an insignificant probability that corn could break $5. In fact, I think the probability has been running about 25% chance of breaking $5. And so that might be one scenario to look at. We're going to talk more about that on the next slide, but that would make the math quite different here. But conversely, there's probably a 25% that corn's going to be substantially below 4. So that's going to make preventive planting even better. So don't just use one price when you're looking at this. Use 2 or 3 prices and see and do the comparisons.
Yeah, and then we've talked so far about corn prices. If you think about soybean prices, there doesn't appear to be a lot of upside potential, particularly in light of the fact that it doesn't seem like we're making a lot of headway with the negotiations with the Chinese with respect to moving exports across the the Chinese market. So if you think about it, one of the concerns is how many acres might actually get switched to soybeans. That's unclear at this stage. There's been some preliminary estimates out suggesting we wouldn't see much switching that we'd simply see some prevented planting corn acres, but I think all of that's really up in the air. But the upside for soybean futures appears to be much less than the upside for corn futures, I guess, is the key point going forward here. One more thing before we move on to this slide. I think some of our viewers are probably thinking, well, I didn't carry 85% coverage, and that's especially true southern Indiana, southern Illinois, I think southern Ohio. So if you were maybe purchased 75% coverage, how does this start to shake out? Well, really the computations are about the same, except your coverage level gives you a lower prevented planting revenue expectation. So instead of that net of 361, at 75%, if you started off with the same initial yield that we had here, 209, and I recognize that in many cases that wouldn't be quite that high, but if you start off with that 209 that we were using at 75% coverage level, that 361 turns into 315. So that gives you an idea as to how that comparison shakes out. Still favors prevented planting, but it doesn't favor it as strongly as it does when you carry the higher levels of coverage.
Another thing to kind of keep in mind here, and I don't want to push this too far because we didn't want to do umpteen scenarios here. If you're looking at scenario 2 and 3, further in southern Indiana, southern Illinois, the yield declines might not be quite as high as what we've illustrated here. This is more trying to grab Indiana as a whole rather than looking at specific regions, and so you want to take a look at our assumptions and plug in your own numbers.
Yeah, that's right. Good point. So we've done some analysis here. We made some assumptions. We tried to make the assumptions pretty clear, but I think the question is, what are we missing in this analysis?
Quite a bit.
Yeah. What are some things that could cause maybe things to look different after the fact than what we're currently projecting? And let's just kind of walk through a couple of those. So some additional considerations to think about. They're not always easy to quantify, but at least worth thinking about a little bit. The first one is USDA has clarified that to qualify for the Market Facilitation Program payments, the MFP payments, you have to plant. So you don't qualify for those acres if you take for that payment if you take prevented planting. There's been some question about that in recent weeks as to which way USDA would come out on that. There's been an announcement this week that they cannot make MFP payments on prevented planting acres. So that's been clarified. That leaves open the question, though, as to how large those MFP payments will be. So USDA announced in late May that, first of all, the total dollars going to MFP this time would be larger than they were last year, but they're going to be distributed across a broader number of crops. And then the second thing they said was they're going to distribute it in 3 payments, with the first one scheduled to occur later this summer, sometime after the July 15th FSA reporting date. But they didn't say if you could take the total amount divided by 3. Just a lot of ambiguity there. And they did say that although the first payment appears to be guaranteed, the second and third payments are not guaranteed. They'll make those if they determine later that they're needed. So clearly some questions as to how large those would be and whether or not you could count on it. It's not going to be 0. I think we're pretty comfortable saying that, but we don't know the magnitude. And that's going to have some influence perhaps on some people with respect to encouraging acres to be planted to capture the MFP payment that otherwise might not have got planted.
Now, if we look at last year's payments and you kind of divide them between, most of them went to soybeans, of course, if you have a corn-soybean operation. But if you add all your corn and soybean acres and divide by the payments, it was for a 209 bushel farm, a farm that had corn yields of 209 bushel and 65 bushel of soybeans, the payment would have been $55 to $60 per acre.
On average, across those two crops.
Across those 2 crops, and so if they're larger this year, but it's important to point out that they're larger this year, but they're also spread over more crops.
More crops, and the second and third payments not guaranteed.
Yes, that was the same last year. The second payment was not guaranteed, and we got the second payment. But again, there's no guarantee you're going to get all 3 payments.
Right. So it's a bit of a wild card, but that's the way it is. The second one is this recent passage just earlier this week of the disaster bill. Apparently has some dollars in it that would go towards prevented planting acres. And the question there in our minds is, would the dollars from that disaster bill that goes to prevented planting acres offset the fact that you didn't qualify for the MFP payments? We have no way of knowing. It's probably going to offset part of it, but how much, we just don't know. So that's a wild card out there as well. So initially you had people, I think, thinking that we needed to plant to catch the MFP payments. That's true. However, if you take preventive planting, you might get a disaster payment that would offset at least a portion of what that MFP payment was going to be. So that's a bit of a wild card. We've talked about this a little bit this morning, Michael. If you plant corn late, it's going to reduce your APH for next year.
Yes.
How much? Up in the air.
Yeah, it depends on how low your yield is this year, obviously, and that's hard to predict, as we've been talking about.
However, it's not likely to be a big hit on APH, particularly if you're planting early in the season here, and given the fact that we're looking at a 10-year calculation for APH. So it's a negative, but it's maybe not a huge negative. This one is kind of interesting. If you plant, you qualify for the harvest price option, and that's been a change in crop insurance over the years. Most of the crop insurance policies that are out there now include the HPO option, which effectively means that your revenue guarantee can be calculated as the higher, using the higher of the February average, which you already know, which was $4 on corn, or the October average of December futures. Given the likelihood that we're going to see significant acres in the prevented planting program and the likelihood of some reduction in yields, that combination makes the possibility of the HPO coming into play in 2019 significantly higher than normal or than average, right? And how much of an increase in these futures is needed for that to be significant? Well, you could do a lot of computations to come up with an equivalence point. But I think the bottom line is if these futures get above $5, that starts becoming attractive. Maybe at prices below 5, but not too much below 5 does it become very attractive. But if above 5 is when that starts getting interesting. However, you got to remember that your revenue guarantee as you move through June is declining 1% per day. So on one hand, the HPO option could wind up pulling up your revenue guarantee at the same time that daily reduction in coverage is pulling it down a little bit.
But probably most producers aren't going to plant much past June 10th. I don't know if that's the magic date or not. And so you're pulling it down, but you're not pulling it down significantly. And so I think this is a pretty big deal that some people aren't really thinking about, perhaps. And so we wanted to definitely make this point that your revenue guarantee could be substantially higher if we do see a spike in corn prices.
Yeah, and so let's just take a look at that in maybe just a little more detail. This is a chart you put together back when we were doing our crop insurance webinar a few months ago. And it looks at the ratio of harvest prices under the HPO option to the projected prices that were released in those individual years back in February. So I'll let you walk through that a little bit.
Yeah, Jim's got the bars in red here when the ratio's above 1. So if the ratio's above 1, the harvest price is higher than the projected price. That's happened about 25% of the time or 26% of the time. But notice in years where that does happen, some of those years it's substantially above 1. And the year I really want to focus on in 2012, notice that ratio is like 1.3. Meaning that the harvest price was substantially higher than the projected price. That led to a much higher revenue guarantee for farmers in 2012 than they would have had if they didn't have the harvest price option. How much? Using a case farm in White County, that increased the revenue guarantee in 2012 $310 per acre. Huge. Now, we're not saying that's going to happen in 2019, but if corn spikes to 5 or above, you're going to see a relatively large increase in that revenue guarantee. That's not trivial. It's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at this preventive planting versus planting corn and planting soybean scenarios.
Yeah, so just in round numbers to think about that, if it went to 5 with the February average at 4, that's a 25% increase. It's $1 a bushel. If you're looking at 200 bushel APH and you had the 85% coverage, that works out to about $170 per acre increase in your revenue guarantee. So something to think about. Obviously not a guarantee that's going to happen, but it is something to be aware of. And I think more importantly, or maybe just as importantly, is to think about the fact that if you don't plant, you take the prevented planting, you don't qualify for that. And so there might be some confusion out there with respect to that.
I don't know, is the analogy bird in hand versus bird in the bush. I mean, there's one is more certain than the other, but certainly the planting option does have some upside that we weren't included in the computations, and so that's some of the main points we wanted to make with the last couple slides.
Yeah. We were talking about it earlier. I think the analysis we've presented here, particularly as we walk through the scenarios, is really kind of a static analysis, conditions as they exist today. In all likelihood, the actual returns are going to differ from what we projected, but it's the best information we've got today.
And as I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to have farms that are going to do a combination of these things. They're going to have some acres where preventive planting makes sense because you just can't get in there in a very timely fashion, and they're going to have other acres that they can get in there fairly quick if they haven't already, and those acres they're going to plant. And so it's probably going to be a combination of these different options.
Okay. All right, that kind of wraps up our discussion. You can download the slides we used in this video on our website, purdue.edu/commercialag. And if you go there, you can also find links to some really good delayed planting crop production management videos that were just produced here in the last few days by Purdue Extension with our crop production specialist, Bob Nielsen, who's our corn production specialist here at Purdue, Sean Castile, who's our soybean production specialist, and Bill Johnson, who's our weed management specialist. So those are really good videos. There's 3 short ones out there. The links are on our website. I'd encourage you to tap into those as well. So with that, thanks for joining us, and best of luck as you try and wrap up this 2019 crop planting season.